This video was written during 7.1. If you're not seeing it until later, then depending on what, if anything, changes, it's possible that it's no longer accurate to my thoughts and feelings. For a while now, job homogenization has been a hot topic. My opinions on it are shaped by my flexibility at the highest level, and the surrounding discussion made me realize that such flexibility is causing me to have less fun. I'd like to offer that unique perspective today, in a tale of loss, fire, and faith. This video will address the titular claim, but also look in depth at every role and job, how homogeneous they are, and how that affects the way the game is viewed and played. There's going to be a lot of what might appear to be back and forth here, so please stick with me even if you don't agree with what I'm saying in that moment, and please refrain from commenting until you've seen the whole video through to the end. Those of you who've watched back some of my older stuff would know that I absolutely adored Endwalker Black Mage, but I did have interest in all other jobs too, as my gameplay focused on job mastery. Endwalker was also the first one for which I raised every job to level cap while it was current. I played them all well and had fun learning them, but none of their optimization ended up appealing to me as much as non-standard Black Mage rotations. So Black Mage was the only job I continued to have fun playing when I was already good at it. Naturally, it would eventually become the only job I enjoyed raiding as. Unfortunately, if Endwalker was a calm ride in the back of a roof-down convertible, Dawntrail was a lethal shot to the head. With the release of Dawntrail, as you likely know, the aspects I and most other Black Mage players enjoyed about it were removed entirely, in favour of making the job far more rigid and far more difficult. That could have been the end of things, but there was no time to grieve, as the show must go on. We had promising proposals for future patch content, and I now had a large pool of jobs I was equally comfortable playing to do that content on. I may have had no favourite anymore, but I had 20-second favourites that I played exceptionally well. Something I still to this day feel as though I am alone in. The only question that remained in my mind was how I would choose between those jobs. With no preferences to go off of, I decided I'd analyse gameplay niches and make my choice based on viability, as there is more depth to this than a lot of people will give it credit for. I could stay within my home as Black Mage, the magic DPS role, whose other jobs outright serve different functions. Summoner is the lowest skill required job across all roles. If you have two hands on a pulse, you can extract most of its value, which does include raise. Red Mage's raise has the unique ability to be chained in quick succession, which makes it a progression staple for any group even a quarter of the way serious. But it gets the job cast aside when already practiced groups outgrow the need for said raise. Black Mage and Pictomancer don't bring raise, but deal extremely high personal damage. The best place for them is confirming a clear with an already practiced group, with varying levels of support for that. It's extremely easy to switch from another job to Pictomancer, so progressing on a different job with greater utility, then swapping to Pictomancer to secure the clear, is usually the play. Black Mage, on the other hand, is extremely difficult to switch from a different job to. If you're bringing a Black Mage at all, you're most likely bringing it for all of prog as well, which harms prog significantly. I could take a small step out towards ranged DPS whose distinctions are a bit harder to pin down concretely, but by squinting really hard I found that Bard is a damage buff specialist, with multiple up at once during burst windows, and their songs always up. It lends itself well to 2-minute meta gameplay. Machinist's focus is its own personal damage as a selfish DPS, something that lends well to carrying in unoptimized environments, especially later in the tier when it's overgeared. Early in the tier, it sits in a paradoxical spot of undesirable until it's geared, while also pretty low priority for that gear. Dancer is the prime support class, and the other side of Machinist's coin. While Bard escapes Machinist's main drawback by being buff-focused, Dancer outright exploits it by dance partnering a gear-funneled melee, or Pictomancer, which can be argued to be progression utility in the early weeks. This exacerbates other single-job balancing issues such as Fruit Pictomancer, in a way other jobs can't, which in turn makes Dancer somewhat composition-dependent in a way that has otherwise been thoroughly purged from job design. It's hard to argue that melee DPS serve different functions like magic or ranged, but their identity is, in a sense, being Achilles. They're all near-perfect executions of the same function, but each one has a different fatal flaw intentional to their design that must be played around and aren't necessarily equal. Monk's lack of a ranged attack makes disengaging as it feel far worse than it does for other melee. While Six-Sided Star can potentially be better than a ranged attack for short, non-forced disengagement, encounter design is now increasingly more willing to force very long disengagement under which everything starts to unravel, which was confirmed to be intentional and escalating in a recent live letter. While Samurai's forced hardcasts are generally seen as unproblematic, the Samurai player has little if any control over when they come up, especially during 2-minute windows, so periods of extended movement at just the wrong time can cause great issues, which again, encounter design seems increasingly willing to do. Viper is very powerful in full uptime, and can even disengage at no theoretical loss thanks to Uncoiled Fury. However, it is the hardest builder spender of all, meaning it is completely crippled in terms of damage output by any amount of untargetable downtime. Even though Reaper's optimal burst, Double Enshroud, has been allowed to exist for this long, Enshroud's cooldown and the job's gauge negativity would suggest this is completely unintended. As a result, it remains extremely counterintuitive and very easy to get wrong. While Dragoon used to have a lot of similar management that was punishing to get wrong, Dawntrail traded complexity for consistency in most areas. However, one thing remains, and it's kind of a stretch. The longer than usual combo makes Dragoon far more punishing to fundamental mistakes, such as the kind of misinput that will naturally happen during intense mechanics when the player is flustered. Lastly, while Ninja has no discernible objective flaw, it is alone in that, and therefore not homogeneous. While support roles are not my area of expertise, I still know a lot about them, so let's see if I can't make the argument there too. The first of those are the tanks, which take different approaches on paper. Warrior's easy to use and defensively oriented, Dark Knight's damage focus and lends well to 2-minute meta gameplay, Paladin brings progression utility unique to it, and Gunbreaker is second best at everything with no discernible weakness. These differences in approach, however, go largely ignored. In practice, the tanks are interchangeable as their differences are very small. Lastly are the healers, which are extremely easy to talk about at length thanks to the healer Punnett square, or the Hololive alignment chart if you're inclined to that instead. The x-axis represents intelligence, the y represents purity. 14's healers fit comfortably on that same scale, with one going into each quadrant. In this case, purity is the in-game role designation of pure versus barrier healer, and intelligence would be the amount the player needs to play the job well, so effectively a measure of difficulty. If you play any amount of healer, you likely already know where I'm putting your healer. White Mage starts us off in the top left, pure and dumb. White Mage is the easy starter healer focused on raw throughput with a very straightforward toolkit. What it may lack in mitigation, it gains in panic buttons, which gains a lot of simplicity and reactivity that the other healers just don't have. Astrologian, White Mage's competitor in role, goes top right, pure and smart. Astrologian's playstyle is one of heavy management. The small buttons add up to housekeeping gameplay of sorts, while the large buttons are delayed and must be prepared in advance. Scholar, the first of the barrier healers, goes bottom right, impure and smart. Scholar's entire kit is situational tools, but there's one for every occasion. Some of those lock out others though, so scholars can very easily make the wrong decision and hurt themselves because of it. Lastly, Sage, Scholar's competitor in role, goes bottom left, impure and dumb. Sage is a lot like Scholar, but without its janky skill interactions. Its abilities all flow very cleanly into one another, and it's very easy to figure out how they synergize, which makes Sage somewhat of a safe job in the same vein as White Mage. That isn't all there is to it though. Healer is the only role in which the harder jobs are also objectively the stronger ones. I deliberately avoided mixing power at first, but power is relevant, so... Firstly, among the pure healers, managing all of Astra's moving parts rewards it with not only pure healing, but the mitigation that White Mage lacks. which is a huge problem for White Mage. While it has the most pure healing, it is often argued that it has way more than the fight actually necessitates, which makes the lack of mitigation stand out more. We'll get back to that. What about the rest of the kit though? Well, White Mage isn't doing too much better there either. Astro is not only the most mobile healer, thanks to a second charge and cooldown reduction on Lightspeed, but it also brings a raid buff, and Oracle is a comparable damage spike to Uplotus Misery in the 2-minute window. It's at least a little bit closer between the two barrier healers. While Sage is by no means weak as severely as White Mage, it lacks answers or parallels to the Mage's strength of Scholar. Sage lacks the ability to rival deployed critical Adlo anywhere in its kit, has a fair bit less recovery than Scholar should things go south, doesn't have Expedient, and of course doesn't have a raid buff. Scholar and Astro end up very unpopular every expansion, because no matter what overpowered thing they add, people just keep playing White Mage and Sage forever, either out of loyalty to them or because they view Scholar and Astro as full of too much bullshit to deal with. I think this imbalance within the healer role is deliberate. I believe the problem is that Square Enix knows how much of a botched hit Scholar has, not in power but in how it's considered to feel. This is probably why they keep giving Scholars such absolutely crazy abilities like Expedient and Seraphism, because they desperately need people to play it despite the horrendously clunky kit. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that if those utilities weren't Scholar and exclusive and Sage was given real answers to them, the play rate of Scholar would drop significantly. The White Mage vs Astro case, however, is considerably more extreme. For White Mage to get the changes it needs, it would have to sacrifice its place as the no-bullshit starter healer to Sage, and I don't see that ever happening. At least not to the degree that it would need for people to be willing to deal with Astro, the most contentious job in the game. This healer section was pretty long, but I still barely scratched the surface. I have so much more to say about each one, so I'll likely be making follow-ups at some point, discussing individual jobs in more depth. You may think you know where I'm going with this by now, but what if I told you that this long assertion that jobs aren't homogenized very much if at all is in and of itself evidence of homogenization? People are only so perceptive to find differences like these because the rest of the job is so similar, and that feeds into two main problems. The first of which is that you never actually need to think about these things, as playing the meta is entirely optional. I'm not sure what kind of players my audience are, but the wider majority of 14 players have most likely never thought about their jobs the same way as me. Even more still, have never let meta and viability factor into their job choices. Every single one of them is better off for it. I honestly kind of envy their naivete. Most players have a favourite main job, and have the most fun when they're playing that job. If that job isn't doing too well at the minute, its mains would have more fun brute forcing it in a suboptimal situation than they would if they had switched to something better. Thankfully for them, the community encourages this approach even at the highest level, but it's only possible thanks in large part to homogenization. I'm sure most people have been told in one context or another that any combination of jobs is viable in any content, and that, shockingly, is almost always true. Content in 14, especially high-end content, is designed around its checks. Enrages or hard mechanics late in the timeline serve as damage checks. Every occurrence of unavoidable damage serves as a healing or mitigation check. And many individual mechanics are body checks. For such checks to be possible for every comp, they seem to assume the challenger's team composition is simultaneously the worst at everything, at least within the range that the standard comp can be. To tune incoming damage, the pure healer is assumed to have Astra's reduced pure healing, and White Mage's lack of mitigation, and a shield healer partner. In terms of the DPS comp, it's assumed to have double Fizz ranged Raise caster's lack of damage for purposes of beating Enrage, but double melee damage caster's lack of recovery for mechanics where mistakes were intended to be recoverable. Therefore, even when a job is significantly more powerful than its competitors, it still isn't required to clear the content. This relates to homogenization for balance reasons, as the balance needs to be especially tight as a result. Firstly, it needs to be actually identifiable what the worst comp is, and secondly, the game needs to not be totally trivialized when you do bring the actually good jobs. For an example of what happens when jobs are less homogeneous and balance isn't as tight as it needs to be for this approach to work, look no further than through Pictomensa. While the burst comp can still barely compete, the extreme degree to which Pictomensa provides an advantage cannot possibly be understated. In TF, Picto will often be the difference between beating Enrage and not, as most players are, to put it kindly, not skilled enough to reach their supposed prog point without Picto. Even in a static full of top tier players, having Picto allows a pull with multiple mistakes to still clear. If you wanted that advantage without Picto, you'd have to convince literally the entire rest of your party to swap to the max damage jobs in their role to make up for the loss of not having Picto. This has gotten so bad to the point that people are locking and enforcing that their caster spot is Picto. While it's extremely easy to argue that that's a skill issue, I can't stress this enough that it's not their skill that's the issue. I know a lot of people like to say it reflects poorly on everyone in the party, but really only the party leader is accounted for. Even if the lead is DPS, any of the two other DPS can suck code less, then if you don't have a Picto, you're not beating the DPS checks. In an ideal world, this would be a wake-up call that the people who are making the mistakes are realistically prog-lying, but the leader doesn't choose whether or not the bad player attempts the fight. The most the leader can do is kick and blacklist the bad player, which leads to the bad player immediately joining another party, everyone else following them out, and the leader waiting another hour or more for another party to fill where, and this is true, the exact same thing will happen again. But if you can really dodge that by locking Picto, the most popular job in the game right now, that Picto, who in their right mind wouldn't? If you have 7 friends that want to go for a night on the town and none of them have car, if they invite someone else, which person are they inviting? The one who also only walks, or the one who drives a vehicle with 8 seats? And there's our problem. If the game is balanced around the worst comp and the best comp is significantly better, then using it is so much easier that multiple carefully balanced intricacies are skipped over entirely. In this case, Picto eliminates the need to use Gen Draft, or for your clear to be deathless. I was around for another major balancing blunder though, Abyssos. With a bit less intricacy here, it was simply so overtuned that Square Enix had to apologize publicly and have the final turn nerfed because the testers got too good, was the official line. What I believe is more likely is that they failed to identify the worst comp and accidentally balanced the tier's DPS checks, especially in but not limited to the final turn P8S, around a high damage comp instead. While every individual job managed a week 1 clear, the worst among them, such as Paladin and Machinist, had to be propped up by forcing an otherwise totally meta comp, something most of the player base had not been exposed to yet, as nothing like it happened during Shadowbringers. But if you think that part isn't entirely accurate, show me a log for a week 1 Abyssos double fizz ranged clear including Machinist. First person to do so gets their comment pinned. Hydration. Last thing for this pod is I often see the statement of, well, if the balance team needs jobs to be perfectly homogeneous balance in this hard holy trinity game where Parsimon keeps map rotations perfectly to the exact GCD and share them on publicly available websites, then they aren't particularly good at their jobs. And while you won't be hearing any disagreement with that from me, it's pointless to say. It's just not actionable or constructive. What I want to hear instead is what you think they could be doing better. And I don't want to hear it anywhere other than the official forums, to be honest. Ultimately though, in an attempt to create a landscape where balance is easier to do, they've also made it far more important that it is done right. Here is where we start to finally get a little bit warmer. The second major piece of evidence of homogeneous jobs is that it's actually very hard to tell whether flexing roles at all is intentional or not. Firstly, the points in favour. The armory system is an incredible piece of convenience, allowing for all jobs to be leveled on a single character without having to do literally the entire several hundred hour MSQ again. Sharing gear within role is a huge benefit too. Melee DPS less so, but for the others, by gearing one job in the role, you gear every job in the role. You could also argue that the borrowed power nature of the raid gear cycle literally makes gear not matter outside of the context of high-end raiding. Jobs feeling very similar also lends itself well to the ability to switch between them. For example, understanding Dark Knight places you 5 minutes of striking dummy away from understanding Warrior as well. But there are a fair few growing pains that call into question the real intention here. On the topic of many jobs, leveling each one takes a very long time. We're talking at least 2 weeks non-stop grinding to get an old job from base level to level cap. Contrast to WoW, which this system is frequently argued to be better than, where you can get an alt character to endgame in a weekend. As for gear, weekly lookouts are still per character, so by playing multiple jobs on the same character, you're spreading the same amount of gear between all of those jobs. This could potentially result in a situation where you main one role but are flexing to another temporarily, so you end up obligated to not give any of the reward gear to your real main for well over a month, with tombstones and the weapon taking well over 2 months. Fourth offend, you actually want to level a job in every role, gear a job in every role. Spoiler alert, that's literally not possible in the limited amount of time a tier has, unless you start opening non-base Savage covers. Lastly, homogenization of utility runs counter to the idea of switching, making it feel significantly less rewarding to do so. You're not winning more, you're just losing less. And there's a problem. The relationship that 14 has with the idea of changing jobs feels like an uninspiring worst of both worlds. At best, it's creatively bankrupt. At worst, it's downright problematic, and it doesn't have to be this way. If 14 leaned further into jobs having homogeneous utility and great balance, there is significantly more room for those jobs to feel different. This would make any given player's attachment to their main much stronger as their identity is stronger, while still ensuring they're able to bring that main to all content valuably. If 14 leaned further into having homogeneous job feel, there's significantly more room for those jobs to have different utility and even more distinct gameplay niches. This would make it a lot easier to accept a larger difference between an optimal and suboptimal choice, or even have different forms of content outright favor different jobs, as switching according to the situation becomes significantly easier. Having the ability to play only one job and being incapable of others kind of would just stop being a thing, so it would no longer have to be balanced around. Neither of these identities are actually reached. Both job feel and utility are homogeneous, the detriment of what either could be, leaving sort of an identity crisis if I can be completely honest. Jobs don't feel similar enough that most of their skill is transferable, which preserves players' inability to play multiple, but they also don't feel different enough to break the monotony even for flex players. Their utility is still differentiated enough that switching often feels necessary, but not enough so to make players feel like they win more as opposed to losing less. I don't intend for this to come across as conflicting advice, instead this request is more, please make up your mind instead of sitting on the fence. I don't mind which you go with, because the important thing is that you choose one and never look back. When I was talking about this with my other friends who are generally in agreement with this level of criticism, one of them flat out bluntly asked me, what happened to playing the game for fun? And to loop right back to the first point, I think the fun died with Black Mage. I was asked by another if I still enjoyed raiding, and my answer? It depends. Raiding without Endwalker Black Mage made me realize that the reason it continued to be fun when I was already good at it is it recaptured the discovery and learning process every fight, whereas the other jobs felt a lot more solved, for lack of a better word. I also found that after being left only with those solved jobs, they actually are fun, once the tier has also been solved. Less so in prog. Speaking of solving the tier, while most people say that the game gets less fun once it's solved, I'm actually going to go against the grain and say that the absence of Black Mage means optimal job choice is now an extra layer to that for me, and I very much dislike the process. Sensing friction while progging as Endwalker Black Mage was a sign that I was playing the game wrong, and needed to actually take advantage of the job's freedom and incorporate some non-standards. Sensing friction as any job that lacks the freedom Endwalker Black Mage had, however, was a sign that I needed to switch, as I can't just incorporate non-standard that doesn't exist. This has, though it should go without saying, made the experience of prog fucking miserable. I feel like I've been stripped of my agency and placed on a set of rails to go through the motions. Rather than be able to bring things into place myself, I feel as though I'm at the mercy of the game to have things naturally fall into place, and with modern encounter design, they very rarely do. Endwalker Black Mage is only my example because it's my experience, but the same argument could very easily be made for something like Shadowbringer's Summon, Heavensward Machinist, or literally any expansion's Astrologian. And maybe in 8.0 we'll be saying the same thing about Dawntrail Pictomancer, if Cognito has a theory is to be believed. Anyway, to answer what happens to playing the game for fun, if I don't have fun playing, I definitely still have fun in another way. The fun is found after prog, when I've got the tier on farm and I'm doing so as the job that feels least awful in that fight. The fun is found in meaningful low-end content, especially if it's as deep as Bozja. The fun is found when I log in, go into my house, stare at one of my characters for a few hours, then log out. The fun is found when I'm AFK in Limsa, in one VC or another with some friends. The fun is found when I'm people watching in the quicksand, taking a shot every time someone tries to split at me. And most importantly, the fun is what happens when I talk with my friends or on the discussion subreddit about the multitude of ways the game fails or succeeds, and how it could be improving. And to be met with something other than complete vitriol, that I dared say something critical. It almost feels like the community is finally free of the shackles of Endwalker's era's toxic positivity. But I can't lie, the catharsis of that has already started to wear off. I find great enjoyment in critical discussion, don't get me wrong, but the discussion is far more enjoyable when it's balanced. Being vindicated ultimately only means things are getting worse, not better. I would like to praise things as well, but we aren't being given much to praise right now, which makes the role of a creator in this all more important, doesn't it? I really didn't want to talk like this, but I kind of feel like my hand is being forced. If negativity will save this game, I will become history's most brutal critic. I have a lot more to say, both about my relationship with the game and about job identity, but I honestly think we've gone on long enough for today. If I tried to articulate my thoughts much further, that would be the difference between having a March upload and not. Expect multiple follow-ups to this in the coming month. Subscribe and hit the bell, I guess. I really am not good at pivoting into the YouTube things. Wave.